Silence bursting outwards. Deleuzo-Nietzschean affirmation through the paintings of Mark Rothko. Yes, first word of my talk is silence. Yes, today I would like to begin with silence. To begin in silence is to begin in affirmation, one way among many. To begin in silence is to begin in affirmation of Mark Rothko's paintings and words. Rothko himself intimated something profound about his work when he said that silence is so accurate. Deleuze, for his part, seems unable to appreciate Rothko's work, or is at least ignorant of it, offering only a few offhand comments on what he calls abstract expressionism in Francis Bacon, The Logic of Sensation. While he does admit some profundity to so-called abstract expressionist painters, for their rejection of easels, for their use of what he called manual space, his analysis does not fit well with Rothko's work. Deleuze says that abstract expressionism is merely a form that, quote, imposes the hand on the eye. It, quote, makes visible an exclusively manual space, he says. While he only mentions Jackson Pollock by name, he does use the more general name of abstract expressionism in several places, without making any exceptions. I think this tars Rothko with the name popularly used to describe his work among the work of others, although Rothko himself resists this label. Deleuze does say some things worth pursuing in greater detail, perhaps, like when he describes the strange power in which the eye can find no rest, or the elaboration of lines that are more than lines, surfaces that are more than surfaces. But these comments are much too quick. They lack the kind of slowness demanded by Rothko's work. These works are irreducible to the hand, to manual space, and to many other terms that Deleuze might have used. Rothko, for his part, disparaged superficial readings of his work. If you are moved only by their color relationships, he says, then you miss the point. We might repeat this differently. If Deleuze is moved only by the movements of a hand, then he misses the point. Rothko is interested in expressing massive and forceful dramas. He says, I'm interested only in expressing basic human emotions, tragedy, ecstasy, doom, and so on. There's much we can make of this, and so on, as the endless conjunction Deleuze and Guattari created in The Thousand Plateaus, the endless conjunction, and. And so perhaps I'm resisting Deleuze here by reading Rothko so closely, but I shall resist by way of Deleuze's own work. Contrary to Deleuze's offhand dismissal or superficial engagement with the general movement called abstract expressionism, an affirmation of the singular work of painter Mark Rothko provides a rich terrain in which to explore, to illuminate, and to demonstrate the power and value of many of Deleuze's tools for thinking. Truly, Deleuze's passing comments on abstract expressionism are unworthy of the depth and vivacity, the dynamicism, and the weight of Mark Rothko's work. And so by way of a careful reading of Deleuze, with our bodies turned towards Rothko's work, I aim to do justice to the possibilities of Deleuze's own philosophical toolbox by opening up Rothko's work in new ways. I aim to do justice to the possibilities of Rothko's intimate and intense artworks, animating them through Deleuze's concepts of difference and repetition, images of thought, and affirmation. These concepts, which indeed animate me more intensely than his others, are those crafted in difference and repetition and Nietzschean philosophy, but they continue to be palpable throughout the rest of his work. Deleuze and Rothko share at least this in common, a guiding force in all their work, a deep and abiding passion for Nietzsche and his Dionysian ecstasies. In 1950, 20 years before he would be found dead in his studio at the age of 67, Mark Rothko adopted a style in which he continued to work tirelessly, even ecstatically for the rest of his life. Sometimes these paintings are called multiforms, or simply referred to as his late style or mature style, though none of these terms were adopted or supported by Rothko himself. There is a certain repetitiveness to Rothko's work from 1950 onward, a repetitiveness for which he is well known. A repetitiveness that has given him a kind of notoriety. But what compels this man to relentlessly pursue this style for 20 years? What compels this man to develop this style, to simplify it, to deepen and enlarge it for 20 years? What force moves the hand of this man who painstakingly thins his paints with turpentine, boiling them and mixing them with egg whites to make them translucent and glowing before obsessively layering them again and again and again and again? What calms and prolongs the patience of this man who stands before his painting sometimes hours at a time between brush strokes, moving with almost geological slowness to prime and to fill canvases meters high and meters wide? What fuels the anger of this man against those who reduce his work to so-called action painting, or just some mere exploration of color relationships, color wheels, color superficialities? What drives this man to the repetition of a certain style of affect, swirling and submerged in oceans of sensation, billowing smoke dancing in still air, rolling fog inexorably moving in to surround and make weightless? Any thinking of Rothko's work first of all demands a thinking of difference and repetition, the likes of which Deleuze so meticulously lays out in his book of that name, though we need not necessarily think of Deleuze to think of difference and repetition, and we need not think it out in precisely the same way, of course. Deleuze taught us to see difference as primary, as more fundamental than sameness or identity. There is no fixed static no fixed identity or static form of a work of Rothko's, as if each painting were merely some faulty or imperfect attempt to duplicate some self-identical and perfect idea. Deleuze has shown us that it is only by way of the movement of difference and differentiation that things can be seen as similar, that is, as repetitions that include differences. Rothko's work demands such a thinking of difference and repetition if we are to engage with these paintings, if we are to allow them to affect us. Such a thinking would itself be differentiated or doubled at once, in order to think each singular painting, and in order to think the wider body of Rothko's work, or his style more broadly speaking. Each painting is itself a whole, differentiated into various shapes which are vaguely rectangular but irreducible to such precise geometry, borders blurring and oscillating, forms fading in and out. Pardon me. Like uneven soil at the base of mountains, uneven clouds in the night swallowing the moon. Each shape or form is itself differentiated, an unnameable multiplicity of color, an endless dance of overlapping textures, each movement itself composed of many others flowing and being swept along or disrupted by others still. Each gesture, each weft of textures, each multiplicity of forms spills over its edges to make a flood. Another name for that flood is Mark Rothko's body of work, a flood he unleashed in 1950, the flow of which he himself stopped up in 1917. We can still be submerged in those waters sometimes. They flow sometimes in the Tate Modern in the other London, in the Art Gallery of Ontario and Toronto, in the Museum of Modern Art in New York and in San Francisco, in traveling exhibitions and temporary showings. Sometimes they can even flow from grainy digital thumbnails or fuzzy projector screens, as if from a crack in a dam struggling to hold back the crushing torrent of a waterfall. Each painting is a part of that flood, like water in water, each fully absorbed by the flood, and each flowing and raging with the full force of that flood. That force, that weight of each painting becomes impossible to ignore when we understand the massiveness, the depth, the unyielding force of that body of work, and of those 20 long years. But what does this repetitiveness demand from us? How must these differences affect us? How can we do justice to this body of work? How does one stand on a cliff above the crashing sea while bearing the weight of an ocean of air? Silence is so accurate, Rothko says. Silence is so accurate, but what is the silence demanded by Rothko's work? And what kind of accuracy is possible here? This English word accurate comes from the Latin accuratus, which is the perfect past participle of accuro, to take care of. Perhaps then, to be accurate is to have taken care of. Rothko does not say that silence is correct, or exact, or precise. Silence does not represent Rothko's work, nor does Rothko's work represent silence, even if his work is silence-inducing. Rothko does not reproduce silence on the canvas, even if his work itself reproduces silence, in its environment, its viewers, and those who try to describe it and cannot find the words. Rothko says that silence is so accurate because silence has taken care of his work. And in silence, we can try to take care of the artwork confronting us. In silence, we can try to take care of our encounter with this artwork and what it demands of us. In silence, we can try to take care of our response to this artwork and open up possibilities for a future in which our sensations are transformed. Our bodies flow more deeply into surfaces, into feelings, into spaces, times, and silences. Silence is accurate because it takes care of them. But what is this silence? How do we take care of it? In other words, how do we take care to take care? Alfonso Lingus tells us, human beings do not begin to sing and do not sing in dead silence. Indeed, this is forceful, as Lingus powerfully attests in Dangerous Emotions. Our voices begin to purr, hum, and crescendo in the concerto and cacophony of nature and machines. We do not sing in dead silence. Yes, indeed. Do we paint or encounter paintings in silence? Yes, perhaps. But it is a silence that is alive. Yes, silence is alive in Rothko's work. We encounter these paintings in silence that is alive, silence that swells and envelops, silence that draws you in with its slow and unyielding gravitational pull. Silence is pregnant. Silence is an ocean of swirling air and a subtle ecosystem of ambient noises. Silence always carries with it the traces of sounds and their force. A silent room still moves with the quiet weakness of a whisper, or the crashing might of thunder. With Lingus, I insist on not deceiving ourselves about the pervasiveness of this sound. I insist on doing justice to this pervasiveness, whether we call it silence or not. John Cage teaches us that there is no such thing as dead silence. Even in an anechoic chamber in which all sounds are absorbed instead of reflected, one still hears two sounds, one high, one low. The high sound is made by one's nervous system in operation. The low sound is made by one's blood in circulation. Until I die, Cage says, there will be sounds, and they will continue following my death. Silence, Cage proposes, is the absence of intentional sound. Yes, until we die, there will be sounds. Yes, they will continue after our deaths. And so we can say that our feet twitch, our chairs creak, our clothes rustle, our lungs breathe deeply, our blood flows, our bodies buzz electric, here in silence. Here in a silence that is also not silence. A silence that differentiates and repeats. A silence that we take care of. A silence that is alive, rather than a silence that is dead. If this is silence, if this is the silence that Rothko's work demands, then how do we take care of this silence? Perhaps we can take care of it. We take care of this silence by hearing it as a challenge, as a demand, and as a promise. Like nothing else, I think, Rothko overwhelms our mouths and our feet, our eyes and our words. Rothko overwhelms our hearts with slowness, overwhelms our thoughts with emotional and affective volume. Rothko challenges us by defying our familiar concepts, our visual perspectives, our aesthetic vocabularies, our notions of color and shape. Rothko challenges us by defying our expectations of painting, our ideas of skill or virtuosity, our notions of representation, of likeness, of contrast. Rothko challenges what they say about him, when they say his work is simplistic, or childish, or uninteresting. His work is relentless, tireless, burning soft and white. Rothko challenges us to stay with his paintings, to run our eyes over them repeatedly, tracing its contours differently. He challenges us to accept and withstand our confusion, to push past it. Rothko challenges us with strangeness, with simplicity unraveling itself, tangling. Rothko challenges us with silence. Rothko demands we think otherwise. Rothko demands that we encounter otherwise. He does not refute representation. His work bursts out beyond petty bickering, pointless commentary and idle talk, beyond argumentation and refutation. Rothko demands that we think art differently, that we encounter art differently. He demands that we are affected by difference differently, whether it swells from the wall of a gallery to envelop us, or punctures our day from an odd corner of a skyscraper, or stretches small concrete cracks into yawning abysses, or makes our ecstasy burst with the low force of fog spilling out from us in all directions. And this is what Rothko promises. Different differences, different differentiations, differentiations differentiating. This is what Rothko promises. That we become unafraid of repetition, that we chase it while panting desperately, or that we listen for its call and meditate on it while breathing rhythmically. This is what Rothko promises. That we appreciate difference more deeply, whether we see or not, whether we hear or not, whether we speak or listen or think or not, whether we stand or sit or pace or walk or wheel about, whether we take our time or give it, whether we affect or are affected. This is what Rothko promises silently. Rothko challenges our way of thinking. He demands that we think differently and offers the promise of thinking differently. He offers us lines of flight, you might say, with Deleuze and Guattari. But a call simply to think difference and repetition is insufficient, for we have not yet questioned or affirmed the particular way of thinking that would be necessary, the character or force of the thinking that would be necessary. Here we must follow the thread that runs through both Rothko and Deleuze, the work of Friedrich Nietzsche. Deleuze tells us, without doubt, this is the most important point of Nietzsche's philosophy, the radical transformation of the image of thought that we create for ourselves. This radical transformation makes sense and value integral to thought. Perhaps we could say Deleuzo-Nietzschean thought, as I have ventured in my title, to mark the specificity of Deleuze's reading of Nietzsche, which is unique and powerful for its different repetition of Nietzsche's work. Deleuze says with Nietzsche, we will never find the sense of something, of a human, biological, or even physical phenomenon, if we do not know the force which appropriates the thing, which exploits it, which takes possession of it or is expressed in it. Accordingly, we will never find the sense of Rothko's work if we do not know the force which appropriates it, exploits it, takes possession of it, or is expressed in it. This has nothing to do with wanting or seeking power in the crude sense, as when we hear platitudes about Nietzsche supposedly being interested in fascism or violent political domination. Platitudes that have nothing to do with Nietzsche's thought. This would be only the lowest degree of the will to power, Deleuze tells us, an indicator of reactive forces, a concept to which I will later return. Perhaps the easiest thing for our ears and bodies to think of is to think of sense as revealed through the force which is expressed in it. For Deleuze, through Nietzsche, force is pervasive. Phenomena, things, organisms, societies, consciousness, and spirits are symptoms of forces. The general word Deleuze likes to use to refer to things, drawing on Nietzsche and Spinoza, is body. A body is not a field or a medium of forces. A body is itself a convergence of many forces. All reality, Deleuze says, is already a quantity of force. And so convergence of forces, bodies, are everywhere. I myself am a convergence of forces or a body just as much as each of you are. Just as much as this seminar room, this conference, this building, this talk. Just as much as Rothko, his body of work, or any single painting, each constitute a convergence of forces, a body. Just as much as each stroke, each gesture, each form, each canvas, each multiplicity of colors is a body. A convergence of the forces of paint, of powdered pigment, of glue and chalk, of turpentine, of egg whites and suffering hens. A convergence of boilers and bricks, brick factories and construction workers. A convergence of brush bristles, skin cells, muscle movements, and wood. A convergence of light waves and gravity and eyeglasses and boots. A convergence of patience, of insatiable curiosity, of bewilderment, of anger. A convergence of the night sky, of the trees on the hills, of quiet contemplation and awe. A convergence of forces that make space for living silence. We could enumerate forces endlessly, but I am urgently forced to move forward. If we are to radically transform our image of thought through Deleuze and Nietzsche, and do so in a way that is productive for our understanding of Rothko's work, we must appreciate the forcefulness of things in our world, of non-human bodies at any scale. Nietzsche insists on force, in spite of the dogmatic image of thought. This dogmatic image depicts the goal of thought as the attainment of truth and universal good sense, overcoming all forces which divert it, because it depicts forces as false, as merely interfering with truth. This dogmatic image conceives of the correctness of method as an artifice to ward off error, that is, to ward off forces. Anyone who tries to approach Rothko in this way finds nothing. There is no method for warding off falsity or force that one would could employ in the face of Rothko's work. Because Rothko's work is itself forceful. There is no universal good sense to be found in Rothko's work, because force is itself the element presupposed by truth and falsity. There is no truth without force. Soaring like a flock of geese over this, or burrowing like a mole under it, Nietzsche insists that truth and falsity are undermined by a more fundamental reality, the convergence of forces. And this is why sense and value are crucial to philosophy, crucial to this new image of thought. Deleuzo-Nietzschean thought is paired as a hyphenated couple, thought movement. Deleuze tells us that this is not merely in the sense that Nietzsche wants to reconcile thought and concrete movement, but in the sense that thought itself must produce movements, bursts of extraordinary speed and slowness. Yes, this is what Rothko's work demands. Yes, this is why Deleuzo-Nietzschean thought movement searches for stimulants, forces which excite desire, instinct, will. Art is the opposite of a disinterested operation, Deleuze pushes us to realize. Art is a stimulant of the will to power. We, the artists, means we, the inventors of new possibilities of life. This is why Rothko's work offers a promise. This is why the promise of Rothko's work can be forceful. It stimulates desires, instincts, wills. A body can be vividly moving. A convergence of forces can be intensely at work, even if one appears to be standing or sitting still. We can understand this when we understand thought movement as integrated. But as Deleuze forcefully points out, Nietzsche moves us from asking questions of the form, what is, to asking questions of the form, which one, who. To transform our thinking, or our thinking moving, our thinking forcing, we must overcome simplistic questions like, what is Rothko's work? What is Rothko painting? What is a Rothko painting? We must overcome these in favor of asking, which one paints like Rothko? Which one finds Rothko's work forceful or stimulating? Who among us is ready to differentiate ourselves with Rothko's work, to repeat its forces in our own ways? Who among us is ready to be pushed to thought movement? Who among us is ready to learn to walk and to run and to dance and to fly in thought movements? Who indeed? Nietzsche's Zarathustra bursts to tell us, I have learned to walk. Since then, I have run. I have learned to fly. Since then, I do not have to be pushed in order to move. Now I am nimble. Now I fly. Now I see myself under myself. Now a god dances within me. Thus spoke Zarathustra. This is Nietzsche's great affirmation of forces, one among many. Perhaps that god dances with the ecstasy of the Greek Dionysus, god of revelry and wine and theater. Perhaps that god is another force, unnamed or unnameable. Deleuze tells us that for Nietzsche, gods are another name for forces. Jetzt ein Gott tanzt durch mich, Nietzsche wrote. Rereading the German word durch, with Deleuze in our bodies, Deleuzean forces converging, we can perhaps proclaim affirmatively in the face of Rothko, now a great force dances through me. Yes, perhaps Zarathustra is one among us who would find Rothko stimulating in the Deleuzo-Nietzschean sense. Yes, perhaps we can affirm the forces of Rothko's work, finding what excites our desires, our drives, our wills. But which forces? And how do we affirm them? with Deleuze, through Nietzsche, encountering Rothko's work, incorporating it, that is, bringing it into our bodies as a force, one among many. Affirmation runs electric through force. Affirmation is greater, more subtle than force. Affirmation is a kind of will in force, a kind of will that orients and drives forces. It is a will to power. The will to power is the differential and genetic element of force, Deleuze tells us. That is to say, it is the will to power that makes force proliferate, spread out, multiply, generate other forces, bodies, and stimulants. The will to power differentiates and repeats. The will to power is the one that wills in the convergence of forces. That is, the will to power gives forces their quality. Forces are either active or reactive in quality. Active forces produce differences. They unfold and fold them, draw them out and repeat them. Reactive forces produce nothing. They drain the lifeblood of other forces. They chip away at them, eat away at themselves. For Deleuze through Nietzsche, activity and reactivity in these senses gain momentum to become something greater and more powerful. Activity can become affirmation. Reactivity can become negation. An affirmation bursts outwards saying, I am good. I proliferate outwards, laughing. Whatever prevents my good from proliferating, whatever destroys me, is bad. A negation flees affirmation, saying, those forces are evil. Whatever prevents them from proliferating, whatever stops their laughter and their joy, is good. I oppose them, therefore I am good. That's what negation says. Affirmation bursts through and sweeps away negation in a great flood. Deleuze elaborates a Nietzschean concept of affirmation in three parts. 1. Affirmation pushes its convergence of forces to the limit of what they can do, pushes its life to the limit of what it can do. That is, affirmation relentlessly tries to overcome itself, to push its own limits and beyond. 2. Affirmation flows outwards with a plastic, creative, bestowing multiplicity of forces. That is, affirmation pushes beyond its limits to join forces with it, yet other forces, with other things, other emotions, other animals, other ecosystems, other convergences of paint and wood and brick and flesh. Affirmation adapts, creates anew, gives itself away, beautifully squandering its excesses, blissfully ecstatic and laughing, sharing its laughter. It does not bear or put up with, it creates beyond misery. 3. Affirmation is the joyful repetition of its differences. Affirmation doubles itself, repeats itself, saying yes twice. Yes, it goes to its own limits and beyond. Yes, it adapts and creates and bestows, laughing. Affirmation says yes to the whole of becoming, expressed in a single moment. Laughter spreads, envelops forces around it, and joins up with them, bursting outwards. Zarathustra says yes in a tremendous and unbounded way, Deleuze tells us. This is the common ground between Zarathustra and Dionysus. And here he repeats Nietzsche's repetition of his Zarathustra. Into all abysses, I still carry the blessings of my saying yes. Yes, into all abysses. And perhaps Rothko's work is an abyss. Nietzsche continues, but this is the concept of Dionysus, once again. The concept of Dionysus. The god as a force, Dionysus as affirmation. Rothko affirms the necessity of what he calls the Dionysian in a burst of light, a burst of splendor and intensity. This affirmation is the culmination of what I have been saying so far. Affirmation is the culmination of a thinking of difference and repetition, transformed by an image of thought incorporating force and sense. This affirmation will show us the value of such forceful thinking. If this is affirmation, if this is the challenge, the demand, and the promise of Rothko, we must question or affirm what this would mean. Not by saying, what is an affirmation of Rothko? We need to move beyond this, going deeper to ask, which one affirms Rothko? Which will to power? Which forces become active through Rothko's work in an affirmation that goes to the limit of what it can do? Which one adapts, creates, and bestows itself laughing? Which forces say yes, repeat yes? Here is one answer among many. Perhaps it is a force that pushes its power of reading and writing and speaking and listening to the limit of what it can do. Perhaps it is a force that adapts to a call it has heard, a call for submissions, a call for performances, a call for community called a conference. Perhaps it is a force that creates and bestows its creative forces, laughing, sharing them with others, calling them to walk and to run and to dance and to fly. Yes, yes, all of these and more. And here's another answer to the question of which forces affirm the work of Rothko. An answer that is at once shorter and longer. Ecstatic forces. This painting behind me is simply called number 27. Rothko painted it in 1957. What forces can be gathered to do justice to this painting? What forces can do justice to the forces of this work? Ecstatic forces, through the depths of the night. All days begin and end in night. Darkness swells and overflows, threatening to swallow the day. When night falls, it is sometimes as if daylight had never been shining. The night draws you in. The night meditates, and you with it.
Apologies, Andy.
I'm going to start. I'm going to go back a little. What forces can do justice to the forces of this work? Ecstatic forces through the depths of the night. All days begin and end in night. Darkness swells and overflows, threatening to swallow the day. When night falls, it is sometimes as if daylight had never been shining. The night draws you in, the night meditates, and you with it. The night withdraws, drawing intensity outwards and through it. The night comes along like a destroyer, thunder crashing over you with waves of fear and wonder. The night envelops you, swallows you in a sea of fog and the hiss of grasshopper choruses, the inaudible flight of predatory owls, the secret of squirrels sleeping in tree hollows. Is the night silent? The night is breathing, slowly, surely. Each breath while thinking something different. Each breath while doing something different. Each breath while going somewhere different. One night, and since each of them is many, already we have known quite a few. One painting, and since each of them is many, already we are looking at more than one. One interpretation, and since each of these experiments, these crescendos, diminuendos, and phrases is multiple, we are already overflowing. This interpretation does not make Rothko's work a representation, but evaluates it as a convergence and a burst of forces that allows us to make sense of other bodies and forces, like the night, while the forces of bodies of the night allow us to make sense of the massive and voluminous forces at work in this painting. With the promise of affirmation, through plasticity, through creation, through bestowing and ecstasy. Yes, go to the limit of what you can do in the night. Yes, incite ecstasy in the night. The night imposed itself through me with forces I could not ignore. Perhaps this offends your taste. Very well then. Interpret once more. Perhaps better yet, do it silently. There are no facts, Nietzsche told us, and Deleuze is fond of repeating, only interpretations. Maybe Rothko is right when he feared that words would paralyze the viewer. Find your own sense, embody your own value, say yes to your own forces, even without a name, without words, and earn your thoughts by walking with them, by running, by dancing, by flying with them. You will not dirty the movement of my thoughts, my forces, or Rothko's. They will laugh back at you, and perhaps you will rightly forget about them and move onward. If the greatest burst of excitement and force I can muster fails to convince you to transform your relationship to the work of Rothko, whether you have loved or hated him hitherto, then perhaps we should turn to Nietzsche's words when he says in Ecce Homo, how one becomes what one is. I am a principle of selection. I discard much. Or perhaps we should turn to Nietzsche's Zarathustra when he says, where one can no longer love, one should pass by. But who discards the work of Rothko? Which one passes him by? Perhaps you can answer this affirmatively. Perhaps. But I am not that one. I say yes to his multiplicity, yes to his flood. When next you meet any traces, any forces of Rothko's work, be moved to think this: I am somewhere, in silence, bursting outward into laughter. Take questions.
Thank you. We have about 5 minutes for questions, so if there are any, please
Doc?
I will ask a super quick one, and it's super crass.
Okay.
I wanted to ask about the unspoken term, the silence bursting outwards, noise annihilating inwards.
Okay.
And ultimately what this speaks, you talked about what Deleuze could say to Rothko.
Yeah.
Rothko speaking to Deleuze is like, what can we take from the fringes and the borders of Rothko with this play of schizophrenic, transcendental, silence bursting outward,
right.
a nothing producing a something,
yeah.
to this annihilating something that crushes into nothing,
yeah.
you know, the paranoid, immanent. Ultimately, that conquered Rothko, and I'm speaking about like in a very biographical sense.
Yeah.
What does this say? What can we read that back into Deleuze?
That's a very interesting question, and in fact, you're resonating with Rothko in a very profound way.
You know I love it.
Know that. Yeah, so I don't know.
My horrible, shitty Rothko ripoffs on my wall.
No, they're great. I love it. You've differentiated and repeated the forces of Rothko.
But just that crass question of like, ultimately, what is the biographical fact of?
Yeah, I mean, it's very interesting because I don't know how much you've read or listened to, or I guess read Rothko's interviews, or he doesn't write very much, you know. But he says something like, you'll notice two patterns in my work. One is that all the forces rush outwards, or the other is that they all converge and rush inwards. In between those two extremes, you will find everything that I want to say. And so, noise annihilating inwards. I mean, the question of suicide is very difficult. And
again, it's such a like dirty question. I'm sorry to pose it this way, but it's just like ultimately you have to say, well, there's kind of evidence to suggest that one conquered the other, insofar as.
Well, I mean, but what conquered Rothko is a difficult question because, I mean, there seems to be the fact that his work was not widely appreciated, that if you read the commentary, I tried to disparage it in passing without obsessing over it, but, you know, people will say to him like, oh, you're such a brilliant colorist, and you work with color relationships so well, and, you know, there's this great encounter that maybe I could send to you. It's like only like a page long in the writings on art, but it's not really writing, but he just explodes, and I quoted him in this, and he says, yeah, if you only think of the color relationships, then you miss the point. So I think, you know, he's somebody who's romanticizing a time when art was placed in temples and was revered and used as a tool for meditation and this kind of yeah, I mean, maybe noise annihilating inwards is simply another perspective, another way of articulating very much the same thing. And in fact, you know, when Heidegger wants to say that the nothing annihilates, or das Nichts nicht, it's something very similar. And so it seems like maybe there would be some powerful resonances there. I think personally that Rothko is being troubled by the reception of his work, and, you know, people talking about his work in this certain way, like, oh, well, do you have a Rothko? I have a Rothko, as if it's all just a homogeneous body of work, and that one only needs to own this thing to have spoken the last word on the man. You know, he took his giving away of the paintings very seriously. So there's one story about a man who I think curated one of his exhibits or something, or was the director of a museum in which his artwork appeared, and Rothko had given him this work with a very serious earnestness, and heard several months later that the man was thinking about selling it. He wasn't that happy with it, and Rothko marched straight into his home and slashed the painting so that no one could have it. And so the intensity of like his sensitivity to the reception of his artwork, I think, is an integral one to the suicide, and I think that's more
So you're just saying rather than the play of like it being crushed by
Yeah.
the imminence of
Yeah.
the external crushing inwards,
Yeah.
it's just he was living a horrible life
Yeah,
because
and
of the reception of his work.
And I mean, one should also
Sorry,
consider...
I don't mean to
yeah, I'm sorry.
monopolize.
I guess I'm monopolizing
Yeah.
the time
Yeah.
by answering your question. But one quick thing is, I think we should maybe consider the state of his body at the time of his death, because he had been working on the Rothko chapel paintings, for which he had been commissioned in 1964. He committed suicide in 1970, 1971, and it had taken him a tremendous amount of time to create these paintings, and he only very begrudgingly accepted the necessary support of some assistants, because the height, or the enormity of these paintings is remarkable. I have a picture that I don't have time to show, I guess, but it would have been very difficult for him to continue his work, and so I wonder if that had something to do with it. So, I don't know if
sorry, we
Victor...
actually
okay.
don't have time.
I'm sorry, Victor. We'll talk more about it. Thanks so much for coming.
Great, thank you as much.
Yeah.